Tonight we'll be talking about the Jewish experience in medieval Spain, sometimes called the Sephardic experience. But we have to get our terminology straight because often people think of Sephardic as basically the miscellaneous of everything that's not Ashkenazi. If Ashkenazi is originally connected to Germany or having a connection to the Yiddish language or to Eastern Europe, sometimes to Western Europe, Sephardic is understood as just miscellaneous everything else. But in fact, there are some subtle differences to be highlighted there. So I want to show you again our map of the Arab conquest in the Middle Ages. And you'll see in this map that you've got different regions here. So the Jews living in North Africa are sometimes called Mughrabi Jews, or from the Maghreb. You see that Maghreb there in Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. So the North Africans are often called the Maghrabi or Mughrabi Jews. In fact, at one time in Jerusalem, there was a fifth quarter of Jerusalem. Currently, there's the Armenian quarter, the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter, and the Jewish quarter. There was a fifth quarter called the Mughrabi quarter, or the North African quarter. That is what is now the big open plaza that you can see right in front of the Western Wall. Those houses were cleared out in 1967 after the conquest of Jerusalem, and the people that lived there were also cleared out, I will just say. So you have the North African Jews, that's one group. You've got the Jews that live in Spain proper, and Spain itself in medieval times was referred to by the Jews as Sepharad. In fact, these terms, Sepharad and Ashkenaz, are kingdoms way off to the north and west in the biblical literature, but they didn't know exactly where they were. So in the Middle Ages, when they wound up in medieval Germany, the Rhine Valley, or in Spain, they chose those ancient names for it. And so that's why the Jews who had roots in Spain are called Sephardic Jews, because they're from Sepharad, that medieval term. But then there are other Jews that are further east, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Persia, Afghanistan, in Central Asia. And these Jews are more properly called Mizrahi Jews. Mizrahi comes from the word Mizrach in Hebrew, which means the east. By the way, that's also how we get the term Oriental in English. The Orient is the east. And Oriental means to actually orient the map means to put east on the right. You know, you don't have to do maps this way with north going up. You could always do maps differently and blow your mind. And then you could even try doing it without the Peters projection and make it more, more accurate. And then that'll really blow your mind. But in this case, we're used to putting maps with east on the right. And the Eastern Jews, or the Oriental Jews, or the Mizrahi Jews, are those Jews who would basically be to the east of the Mediterranean and points further east. So Syria, Persia, and so on. So again, the term Sephardi generally has this sort of umbrella understanding to it, but there are important subtle geographic differences that make a difference in terms of language, material culture, clothing, food, songs, even religious ideas at times. Today we're going to be focusing mostly on the Sephardic Jews that are in Spain, in Sepharad, because they experienced during the Muslim empires a real flowering of culture, political success, and economic viability that then, of course, has its decline from a number of different factors, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So that gives you the overview of the land. Now, when we're talking about the golden age of Jewish Spain, we also have to, ask that old question of who's telling the story here, because the experience of the Jews in Spain is most often understood as ending with the Inquisition and suffering and expulsion in 1492 and what a disaster it was. But beginning in the 19th century, Jewish historians began to paint a very golden picture of this golden age, where Jewish life was fruitful and creative, and Jews cooperated and collaborated with their surroundings and the cultures surrounding them, and they were welcome to do so. Now, the historians writing about this golden age in Spain were themselves living mostly in Germany, which was at the time debating whether they should fully emancipate their Jews or not. And so Jewish history was deployed in a political argument to try to make it more justifiable. Look what we did the last time we were fully integrated into a society. Now look what we could contribute to German society. So they sort of gilded the golden age, if you want to think about it that way. Even so, taking a more objective view of the historical experience, this was a time of real Jewish stability and success, particularly under Muslim rule, but even for a time under Christian rule as well, as we'll see. So 3 pillars I want to focus on. The first was political. Remember that the Arabs have swept into Spain, which at the time was under the rule of the Visigoths, who were very recently Christianized. And so the Jews were not fans of the Visigoths. You know, it's sort of like they weren't fans of the Byzantines either, being persecuted as having been superseded by Christianity. So when the Muslims arrived, speaking a Semitic language, living in Semitic cultural norms, this was really attractive to Jews. And they, in fact, were very happy to live under Muslim rule, and they became very successful doing so, in part because, as we talked about last time, they did have a role of living in between cultures and languages even. So one example of a famous political success was a man named Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who lived in the 10th century. This is the 900s. He was a physician, well read in what was called at the time natural philosophy. But he also, because of his languages, became a kind of foreign minister, almost a vizier, like a prime minister to one of the local rulers in medieval Muslim Spain, because he was trusted and because he could negotiate with Christian rulers who wrote in Latin, which he also was able to read. He ultimately became a patron of science and scientific learning. Again, the connection between philosophy and science was much more tight in the ancient world than it is in the modern academic departments. And as one example of his success, he was financially successful as well. He sent very generous gifts to the rabbinical academies in Babylonia of Sura and Pumbedita, but he also sponsored rabbinic leadership and learning in Spain itself. There's a famous legend of the time called the 4 Captives, which envisions 4 famous rabbis who were traveling on a ship, and they were captured by pirates and brought to Spain and then freed there by the Spanish Jewish community, and they set down roots and began to teach rabbinic learning there. The message behind the story of the 4 Captives was that medieval Spain was no longer dependent on Baghdad, on the Middle East, for its learning and for its rabbinic training and for its knowledge and self-esteem. They could, in fact, train their own rabbis where they were in Sepharad in Spain, all the way at the end, the western end of the Mediterranean, without having to look all the way back to the eastern end of the Mediterranean and the land between the waters in Mesopotamia to find rabbinic leadership. Another example of an important figure of this period is Shlomo ibn Gabirol, who was very active in writing poetry and doing philosophy. And there are other examples of people who served as generals in armies. And it really is a fascinating period of, well, to use the Spanish term, convivencia, living together, but really collaborating together on political matters. And also, most importantly, this is the second pillar, on cultural matters. You see, Jews living in these circumstances were not foreign to Muslim courts, Muslim elite culture, Arabic language, and they learned from these models to create in a similar vein. After all, Arabic writers assumed that Arabic was the best language ever, and Jews did not want to let them get away with that argument unopposed. So they would, in fact, write poems in similar style and on similar topics to Arabic poetry, and to do so in Hebrew was to reassert the legitimacy of Hebrew language and that Semitic culture, if not in opposition to, at least in parallel to Arabic culture. So I want to share with you a couple examples of these poems, because you'll see that these are not simply pious poetry praising God, as you'll find in the Hebrew Bible. This is actually what we might call secular poetry, poetry that talks about the human experience, and we might find still inspirational and insightful today. So here's one set of this poetry. On the bottom left, you have this poem called A Secret Kept. The girl brought me into the house of love. She was as pure and perfect as Abigail. When she took off her veil, she revealed a form that put to shame the beauty of Esther. Her light shone in the darkness, made everything tremble. The hills started to dance like rams. I thought, now our secrets are discovered. But she stretched out her hand like a woman of strength, Eshet Chayil. That's a quote from the book of Proverbs. and enveloped me with her jet black hair, so the day was immediately turned into night. This is racy stuff to be writing in Hebrew. Now, the irony is many of these people writing these poems are rabbis, are community leaders, are physicians. These are not like, beatniks or artists who are, living on the margins of society. Here's another couple. Self-praise. This, you can imagine, it's sort of like in the rap battle tradition we have today of a battle of poetry where they would brag about themselves and put down the other one. Well, we have the same kind of thing here. Here's Self-Praise by Ibn Gabirol. I am the master and song is my slave. I am an instrument for all practitioners. My poems are like a monarch's diadem and crowns for the heads of all his ministers. I am no more than 16 years of age, yet as clever as a sage of 80 years. Or this nice one by Ben Palakera. If fear is like a rock, then I am a hammer. If sorrow is a fire, then I am the sea. When it comes, my heart increases its strength like the moon that shines brighter when the darkness falls. Again, you think of this in sort of almost a military context, a desire for courage, but then it even gets into themes that we might think are debauched. Here is by Shmuel Hanagid, Samuel the Prince, an invitation. My friend, tell me when shall I pour you my wine? The cry of the cock woke me and sleep has deserted my eyes. Come out and see the morning light like a scarlet thread in the east. Make haste, give me a cup before the dawn starts to rise of spiced pomegranate juice from the perfumed hand of a girl who will sing songs. My soul revives and then dies. He's hungover from too much wine, and it's morning time. Give me another cup. And you see in this poem the themes of life. You've got, to quote the title of a book about medieval Spanish Jewish poetry, wine, women, and death, all there in that one poem. One of the other interesting things you'll notice about the names, Solomon ibn Gabirol, Judah al-Harizi, these are Arabic styles of titling. In Hebrew, the word for son is ben, Gamliel ben Shimon or Shimon ben Gamliel, early rabbinic leaders. But in Arabic, the word for son is ibn. And so you notice many of them take the name Solomon ibn Gabirol, Judah al-Harizi, that is Judah the Harizi, again, using that al-Arabic beginning. So in the earlier period, when they're living primarily under Arabic rule, and the Arabs are in charge of most of Spain before the Reconquista, they're using Judeo-Arabic as a daily language and even for their own names. Over time, however, as we'll talk about with the decline, Spain begins to be reconquered by the Latins, or those speaking Spanish or medieval Spanish at the time. And Jews also begin to adopt that language as well. They learn what is called at the time Ladino, ultimately called Judesmo, which is medieval Spanish written in Hebrew letters with some Hebrew words included, just like, as we'll see, Yiddish is medieval German written in Hebrew letters with some Hebrew words included there too. A very parallel development. So learning this Ladino, they begin to get influenced by that culture as well. And so what I'm going to do now is I want to share for you, I see a chat message there. Oh, we'll come back to that later. I'm going to share a video with you that talks about a famous legend. It's describing the birth of Abraham. Avraham Avinu is presented in the song. But as I play the song for you, I want you to think a little bit about what other cultural legend has infiltrated the story of Abraham, and why is it interesting that they've included that in this version of the story. So it's about a 2-3 minute musical piece. Did you recognize the story? A light shining over part of a town that proclaims the birth of a miraculous figure. And the king wants to kill all the babies around because of the birth of this person. Okay, so you can see it's the Jesus story, which itself is loosely based on the Moses story. Remember, Moses is born under a sign of death and is saved miraculously. So it's sort of a replay of a replay. But certainly the star shining over the neighborhood, I mean, it's very much a drawing on the Christian narrative. So clearly the Jews writing this song are familiar with that story and have decided to domesticate it by projecting it into the Abraham narrative as opposed to the Christian story. The last example of a poet that we're going to look at in just a little bit of detail is Judah Halevi, who lives in the early 12th century, so we're the early 1100s here. And some of his poems are pious and some of them are, again, very human. So we'll look at the middle one first. My love washes her clothes. I love this one. My love washes her clothes in the water of my tears. Her brilliance makes them dry. Having my two eyes, she does not need well water. Her beauty contains the sun. I mean, it's sad, but it's also beautiful imagery there. And then this one on the right, which is a little more pious of a poem and a very famous one, My heart is in the east. My heart is in the east, and I am at the depths in the edge, either at the edge or in the depths of the west, depending on translation. My food has no taste. How can it be sweet? How can I fulfill my pledges and my vows when Zion is in the power of Edom and I in the fetters of Arabia? It will be nothing to me to leave all the goodness of Spain. So rich will it be to see the dust of the ruined sanctuary. So here he is sitting at the edge of the west, all the way in Spain, but his heart belongs to Jerusalem, the direction he's facing to pray. And he's suffering in diaspora, he says. How can I be joyful when Jerusalem, again, Zion, as the hill of Mount Zion stands in for Jerusalem and Israel proper, is in the power of the non-Jews of Edom, and I am stuck in the bonds of Arabia. And I would leave all the goodness and richness of Spain to see the dust, even just the dust of the destroyed temple would be precious to me. And so Halevi, despite his success in medicine, in poetry, and philosophy, he writes a very famous book called the Kuzari, which is an argument for the preeminence of Judaism over Christianity and Islam, but using philosophical arguments, winds up leaving Spain and trying to make his way to the land of Israel near the end of his life. And it's unclear exactly how it ends. Our last sighting of him is in Egypt. And so either he dies there, or the legend goes, he makes it all the way to the gates of Jerusalem and he's run over by a horse. So make it as tragic as you want it to be, but that's Halevi. But I did want to share two other poems by Halevi to get a flavor of him. One is, you'll see here, Hymn for the Atonement Day. Lord, your humble servants here, suppliant now before you. Our Father, from your children's plea, turn not, we implore you. Lord, your people sore oppressed from the depths implore you. Our Father, let us not this day cry in vain before. So this is a very traditional, pious poem. Sounds nothing like the love washing her clothes in my tears and then, making them dry with her brilliant beauty. Very different feel here. And then the last one, and I love this one because of its human wisdom, is called The Gray Hair. One day I observed a gray hair in my head. I plucked it right out when it thus said to me, you may smile if you wish at your treatment of me, but a score of my friends soon will make of you a mockery. Well, isn't that how it goes, right? So you get a feel for this cultural milieu of creativity, of openness to the human experience, not just to religious piety. And sometimes, by the way, the rabbis would complain about this. They'd say the people aren't taking this seriously here. And Sephardic culture in general had this sort of reputation of being a little bit lax in its orthodoxy. Officially, the synagogue's orthodox are keeping kosher and so on, but maybe they're a little bit more flexible than the kind of Ashkenazi fanaticism that we'll see in later historical moments. Now, the third pillar of the Golden Age in Spain was there was the political engagement with the outside world. There was the cultural interaction with the outside world that leads to inner Jewish creativity. And the third is specifically inner Jewish creativity and its religious developments. And they really go in two directions. On one hand, you have the flowering of Jewish mysticism, often sparked by Neoplatonic readings of the world and of the scriptures themselves. And remember, in Plato's thought, there's the surface knowledge of something, and then there's the knowledge underneath it, and the knowledge underneath it. You remember maybe Plato's metaphor of the cave, where someone is sort of chained looking at a wall, and someone is using puppets with a fire to put shadows on the wall. And some people think that all there is in the world is just the shadows on the wall. And then maybe some people manage to free themselves from the chains, and they turn and they can look at the fire and see the real objects that are being used for the shadows. But even those are imitations of the real world outside of the cave. And when you get out of the cave, the sun is so brilliant, you can't even look at the reality of the world. You have to look down because you can't handle the brilliance of the sun. And maybe you look in a pool of water and see reflections of the real things that are out there in the world. And it's only those who reach the highest level of emancipation and philosophy who are able to raise their gaze and look at the real objects that make up the real ultimate truths of the universe. This is very much an elitist kind of philosophy. You understand the hoi polloi are the ones looking at the shadows in the cave and being, told what to think by other people. But it also can lend itself to a kind of mystical exploration because, there's the surface meaning of what the text says. Abraham got up in the morning. Okay, fine. But what is the layer below that? And what is the layer below that? And what is the ultimate truth that's trying to be conveyed here? Does Abraham got up in the morning mean he was on an ascent? Does it mean he had a mystical experience? Does it mean he's returning from something? I mean, you can try to read layer into layer into layer. And so this mystical thought finds its culmination in a book that is compiled, most likely edited, even written in the 13th century, based on pre-existing materials. And today it's called the Zohar. Now, the Zohar is attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived in the 130s BCE, 130 CE, 130s of the Common Era. So it's projected back about 1,000 years or more. But it was most likely put together by a man named Moses de Leon. You can see that they've begun to Spanishize because now his source of identity is from Leon, a town, and it's Moses de Leon instead of Ibn or Al, right? He claims to have received this from a vision, and okay, fine. Most likely he put it together himself. But the Zohar describes Shimon Bar Yochai and his followers wandering around and giving these in-depth mystical interpretations to the Torah. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum from the mystical approach, as exemplified by the Zohar, but not limited to that, was the rise of Jewish philosophy. Because Jews in this period are beginning to read Aristotle and Plato and other thinkers who have tremendous insight into the way the world works and into logic and into reason. And they have no revelation at all because they don't talk about Moses or the Torah. How is it possible that people can be so smart and not be Jewish and not have Jewish culture? This was mind-blowing for the Middle Ages. So they had to come up with some way to harmonize these two sources of truth, or find ways to make them say the same thing, or agree with each other, or in other ways, find a theory of knowledge that can account for both revelation a la Moses and Torah and deep insight into the world a la philosophy. And so this harmonization process today is called Jewish philosophy and really finds its sort of heyday in the Middle Ages with people like Judah Halevi, who writes the Kuzari, again, trying to argue that Jewish thought is the best and most pure compared to Christianity and Islam. Or the other famous example is Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, sometimes known by the acronym Rambam, which stands for Moses ben Maimon, who was born in Spain and he lives throughout the 12th century, again, the 1100s. He winds up moving with his family through North Africa to Cairo. There's some debate over whether his family actually converted to Islam or not, because they were traveling through fanatical Muslim territories that were demanding Jews convert. So it's unlikely they could have made that trip if they were out as Jews. And he shows some interesting sympathies to Jews who underwent a forced conversion to Islam in later life. Anyways, the Maimonides family sets roots in Cairo, where he becomes the leader of the community. I mentioned last time we have examples of his handwriting from the Cairo Geniza because people would ask him questions. He would write his recommendations, his prescriptions as a physician, and he became known as an authority, and people would write letters from all over the place to ask his opinion. And Maimonides writes two massive works of importance in this period. One is he creates a compilation of all the laws in one place. If you read the Talmud, it's not always clear what the actual law is. You know, it's like reading a Supreme Court decision, but it doesn't tell you the law code. You need to read the summary at the end, or how does the law get imposed? So what Maimonides did was went through all the Talmud and rabbinic literature and created a law code. In fact, he called it, with a little bit of chutzpah, the Mishneh Torah, the second Torah, which is a little, you know, again, chutzpahdik to claim. But the idea was, here are all the laws, and here's what you need to do. Boom, boom, boom. Now, it didn't get universal approval, but it is certainly very influential, and it's very mainstream rabbinic thought. He also wrote a book that was in a different language. The Mishneh Torah is in Hebrew, but his other book in Hebrew, in the original language, Moreh Nebuchim, is the Guide for the Perplexed. And the Guide for the Perplexed, he actually wrote in Judeo-Arabic, Arabic written in Hebrew letters. Now, why is that important? Who would have been able to read Judeo-Arabic? Well, they had to be literate. They had to be literate in Hebrew, obviously, as many Jewish men were, but they also had to be literate in literary Arabic, which is not street Arabic. Literary Arabic and street Arabic are often very different. So you had to be literate in literary Arabic to be, so there's a very limited audience of people who could actually read this book. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides asks some very difficult questions. It says, God has a mighty hand and an outstretched arm to deliver the Jews from Egypt. Does God really have a hand and an arm? Or is that just kind of, you know, figurative language here? There are times where it says God gets mad. Does God really get mad? Could the prime mover, in an Aristotelian sense, get mad? Does the God who has no body, and does that being get mad like people? So what he did was he tried to find allegorical or philosophical explanations for why the Torah says what it says and what God is really like. And in the end, he comes up with a kind of negative definition, because we can't know the God directly, but we can sort of cut around him and define around him and say, well, this is not God, and this is not what God is, and this is not what God is. And so maybe you sort of get some positive definition at the end of it. But this was very controversial. In fact, in the 1200s, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed was itself burned by rabbis in the south of France who were much more mystically inclined and were happy to have visions of a God sitting on a throne and seeing legs and arms and all kinds of. And so him saying you couldn't have that was anathema to their approach. And so his book was just denounced as heresy, and it was burned by rabbis who objected to the philosophical approach. So you really find two of these trends happening at the same time. There's religious mysticism getting expressed in the Zohar and something called Kabbalah, which has a kind of secret tradition to it, and in the Jewish philosophy of Yehuda Halevi, Maimonides, Gersonides, and some others. And by the way, these are not working in isolation. Maimonides is aware of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was writing around the same time, and of Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, who's writing in Spain around the same time. And they're aware of each other. And they're all Aristotelians in their own approach, trying to harmonize Aristotle with Catholic Christianity or with Islam. And it's really fascinating that they're all living and working in the same time period in the same project. Now, that's the golden age sort of at its peak, maybe around, let's say, 1000, 1100, but there begin to be a number of factors that begin to impact the decline of this community. First, you have the beginning of the Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain by the Latins, by what we would today call the Spanish. It begins in the 1100s. It accelerates in the 1200s such that Cordoba is reconquered in 1236, Seville is reconquered in 1248, and from the middle of the 13th century through 1492, most of Muslim Spain is confined to the area called Granada, which is in the south part of Spain. It was actually a territory, Granada, not just a little town, but it was much less than it had been. And so after the Reconquista, most Jews are now living under Christian Latins, Christian Spanish, and not under Muslims, even though some still stay in the Granada area. But that's when you get this period of Cuando Redim Rode and Ladino and Yehuda Halevi and these writers living under medieval Spain under the Latins, but still being successful and well-rooted. Still, it leads to some dislocation in that reconquest process. A second factor in the decline is a reaction to the reconquest. As Spain is beginning to be reconquered from the north to the south, there's a new invasion of fanatical Muslim converts from North Africa. There are Berber people called the Almohads, and they sweep into Spain from the south, and their job is to reconquer the territory from the infidels. But they're also, they have the fanaticism of converts, what I sometimes call convertitis, where the convert is more committed than someone born into the identity. And so they famously put a Quran on their swords and say to the infidels, both Christians and Jews, accept one or the other. Take the Quran and convert, or you'll be killed. So many Jews actually flee the Almohads into Christian Spain because it's safer there than it is under the Almohads. It's also in the mid of the 13th century that the Muslim empire begins to fragment. The Egyptian territory is fragmented under the off of the Baghdadi Caliphate into the Fatimid Caliphate, which is a separate empire. And then you have an invasion from the east, where the Mongols, coming out of the steppes of Central Asia, sweep into the Muslim empire through Persia, and they conquer Baghdad in 1258, which leads to, again, a fragmentation of the empire. So all those wonderful advantages that Jews had of this huge empire with no borders and security and safety are becoming undermined because of the fragmentation of the empire and conquering and the conquest of the empire from the Mongols coming from the east. Now, the next stage of the decline of medieval Jewish Spain begins in 1391, and that's the launching of what's called the Inquisition. I'm sure you all expected the Spanish Inquisition, at least in this discussion today, if not in the Monty Python sketch. In 1391, you have the first sort of riots against Jews and hidden Jews living in medieval Spain. And with the beginning of this persecution, you begin the Inquisition. Again, not the Mel Brooks version, but the real version. And we have to remember the Inquisition, in this detail, Mel Brooks got it totally wrong. Because in Mel Brooks's musical version in History of the World Part 1, he says, we started the Inquisition, what a show, the Inquisition to convert the Jews, which is flat wrong. The goal of the Inquisition was actually to root out crypto-Jews, hidden Jews, people who had converted on the outside, but had maintained a secret Jewish identity on the inside. In fact, they were Christian heretics. So if you were a self-admitted Jew, you were not targeted directly by the Inquisition. There were pogroms, there were riots, there were other problems, but the Inquisition was not aimed at you. It was aimed at those secret Jews. And the term they would use for these people was Marrano. We don't use the term Marrano anymore because it was a slur even then, and the community themselves doesn't use it. So what you do instead is the term Marrano comes from the medieval Spanish word for pig, because they wouldn't eat pork. And that was one of the signs that you were a Marrano, as if you said, oh, pork doesn't agree with me. Or you just happen to be home every Friday night and go into a closet and come out with candles lit in their closet, or other kind of suspicious behavior. I mean, the incentives in the Inquisition were terrible, where sometimes you got a portion of the person's property if you denounce someone to the Inquisition. So of course you're going to denounce people to the Inquisition to get money out of it. It was really a terrible period. And some of the Jews who converted were sincere conversos. They really meant to convert to becoming Christian. Others felt compelled to do it for violence reason or economic opportunity. And ultimately, Jews who did convert sometimes became very successful because they had financial resources. They had literacy, which the vast majority of the peasantry was illiterate in Catholic and Christian countries. So they were actually able to advance relatively high, so much so that the Christians began to be suspicious of what they called the new Christians. And there began to be this principle called limpieza de sangre, the purity of the blood, where you actually had to prove your pedigree to show going back generations you were Christian, not just a new Christian recently converted. This is really the beginning of a kind of racialist anti-Semitism where even converting doesn't save you. You're still covered by your Jewish ancestry, even if you're no longer actively Jewish. Now, for those Jews who are self-identified as Jewish, they have different challenges. As I mentioned, there are riots and pogroms. There are also a few examples of what are called public disputations, where a priest or sometimes a Jew who is converted is pressed into service as the argument leader for the Christians, and they choose the rabbi of the community, and they have a public argument. And the theory is that the Jews' errors will be refuted, and they'll be forced to convert by the power of logic, and if not, they'll have to leave. So this becomes sort of a challenging experience for many Jews. There's a famous one, a disputation of Tortosa with Maimonides, who's another Bible commentator and mystical Jewish thinker, where he actually probably gets the better of the argument if you read the transcripts, but it doesn't matter. When you don't have the power, you don't win the argument. And I'll tell you a story about disputations at the end of the class. Ultimately, this reaches its culmination in the expulsion from Spain in 1492, where most Jews leave. It's sometimes described as hundreds of thousands. That's not realistic given the technology of the time, but certainly tens of thousands are either forced to convert or leave after the conquest of Granada in 1492. By the way, Muslims are forced to leave too. It's not just Jews. It's any non-Christian is forced to leave or convert. And the Inquisition continues even after 1492 because, of course, those secret Jews might still be there. Many Jews, by the way, simply go west. They move into Portugal, which is right next door and a different king. But in 1497, they're forcibly converted there too, and they're not allowed to leave. And so that's where you really get a large body of secret Jews who might call themselves conversos, but actually maintain a positive secret Jewish identity. And they're ultimately only allowed to leave in the 1500s. And many of them go for former Spanish colonies or other territories that might be comfortable for them. And this begins a Sephardic dispersion, where they wind up in Amsterdam, where, for example, Baruch Spinoza is from. They wind up in Spain. They wind up in the Ottoman Empire, specifically in Istanbul and in a town called, back then, Salonika. Today it's Thessaloniki, which actually, Salonika, the Sephardic Jews speaking Spanish, become the largest of the different communities living there. There may be 40% of the population is Sephardic, about 30% is Muslim, and 30% is Greek Orthodox. And the Jews are in charge of the port. They're not only, by the way, the shippers and merchants, as we might expect, they're also the schleppers and the pickpockets. And they represent like the manual labor too, so much so that the port of Salonika closed on Shabbat because there weren't any laborers to unload the ships because they all spoke Ladino and they were all these Sephardic Jews. But this is Sephardicness in diaspora, where they keep speaking medieval Spanish, Ladino. They keep calling their synagogues the Cordoba Synagogue and the Toledo Synagogue and the New Toledo Synagogue because they left the old Toledo Synagogue because they had an argument about something. I mean, again, what else is new in organized Jewish life? But their identity is as Sephardic Jews with their roots back in Spain and looking back at the sort of golden period. But there's also an interesting legacy in that Marrano community, the Converso community, of the Converso experience. So let's say you were a Converso family living in Portugal, and you're sending your kid to school, which is, of course, a Catholic school. And you're telling your kid, don't believe everything the priest is telling you. Well, guess what happens 10 years later when you manage to move to Amsterdam and you can come out of the closet as Jews and you can rejoin the organized Jewish community. And your kid comes home from school and says, well, I didn't believe everything the rabbi told me. You see the pattern? you've learned to question. These Sephardic Jews also read the Bible without the filter of rabbinic Judaism. So the rabbis tell them when they come out of the closet in Amsterdam, well, you have to have separate dishes for milk and meat. And they say, where did you get that? That's nowhere in the Bible. Because again, they'd experienced, their Judaism was looking back at the text, but without the rabbinic interpretations. So they maintain some practices and not other ones. There's a really fascinating community in a town called Belmonte in Portugal that until the 1970s or so was very isolated from the organized Jewish world, but they were a surviving Marrano/Converso community. There's actually a wonderful documentary film about them, if you can find it, called The Last Marranos. And this community, if you ask them themselves, are you Jewish or Christian? They say, no, we're Christian. We're Christian. If you ask all their neighbors, they say, yeah, they're Jewish. And the Belmonte community has these interesting traditions. So for example, in the spring every year, they'll go into a secret room they have built in the back of their house and bake flat breads and say blessings all in Portuguese except for the word Adonai to refer to their God. And then one particular ritual they perform that I find fascinating, they go to a body of water and they beat the body of water with willow branches and they pray for Moses and Esther to save them. Now, I can see the body of water and Moses and the Passover story, but Esther? Well, it's seasonally close because Purim is around that time of year. And remember, Esther is a secret Jew. She hides who she is. She lives outside of the land of Israel. She saves the Jews from destruction. So thematically, that would be a natural heroine for someone living in that kind of crypto-Jewish experience. And there are other examples of crypto-Jewish communities that found their way to the New World. In Mexico, for example, there are communities where people light candles on Friday night and don't even know why. And then the most famous example was a Jewish community in Recife in Brazil, which had been initially a Portuguese colony. It had been conquered by the Dutch. And so then the Jews came out of the closet as Jewish under the Dutch rule. But then Recife was reconquered by the Portuguese. That made the Jews in particular danger because now they've admitted they were lying about their Catholicism and they can't go back in the closet anymore. So they had to leave relatively quickly. And so 23 of them got on a ship and went to another Dutch colony called New Amsterdam, aka New York. And so the origins of the American Jewish community also have roots in the Sephardic experience, the Inquisition period, and these Portuguese Jews. So that's a quick overview of the Sephardic Jewish experience, both Spain and Portugal. And Sephardic Jews were so well dispersed even into England before they were legally allowed to be there, because only Christians were allowed into England for a period of time. Nevertheless, if someone was referred to as a Portuguese or a Portuguese trader or merchant, the assumption was that they were Jewish because those were the ones that they experienced out in Western Europe outside of Spain. Because the Western Jewish experience, as we'll find out next time, really closes up and terminates by the end of this period of 1492 because they were expelled from England in 1290, they're expelled from France in 1394, and from Spain in 1492. So by 1500, you couldn't be an out Jew in Western Europe, which is part of the rise of Eastern Europe, but it also is the rise of the crypto-Jews under Sephardic labels that ultimately aren't able to come out of the closet for centuries or until other revolutions create space like in Amsterdam or other empires. The Ottomans were thrilled to get all these Sephardic Jews. Famously, the head of the Ottoman Empire at the time, the Sultan, said he was so grateful to the King Ferdinand and Isabella and Queen Isabella of Spain for having impoverished their empire and enriched his at the same moment. He was so thrilled to get all these Jews with their skills and knowledge and assets to join his empire. And Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire went well for quite a long time, and again, dominated by the Sephardic Jewish community.